Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses. My name is Robert Pears. In this episode, we're going to look at Jack Coe, one of the leaders in the healing revival in the mid-20th century. This was a flamboyant man who was angry sometimes, he was nervy, he was flamboyant, he was controversial, but he was also a humble man. He was a man that had a great compassion for children and for the sick. At the same time, as I said, he could be a reckless man of faith and would challenge and be controversial, as I said. When we look at his beginnings, which were on March 11th, 1918 in Oklahoma City, you could never imagine that this man would go on to be a leader in the healing revival. His parents were by no means religious. In fact, his father had a problem with drinking and with gambling. Well, one night he's out and he gambles away the home and he flees. The mother would find out the next day when somebody turns up and she said, "The house is not for sale." And he says, "I'm not here to buy it, I own it." And she's kicked out, her and the children, on the street. And the Salvation Army would turn up and thankfully provide clothes and would provide them money so they could get tickets to return home to her mother's house in Pittsburgh. There they would live in the basement. And it was a very challenging and difficult time for the family. The mother struggles to take care of them. She would end up going to nursing school, and even when she graduates and becomes a nurse and she's working long hours, she works late into the early morning, she's still struggling to take care of the children. Well, the father would reappear on the scene and he says, "I've changed, I've overcome that problem, come back, it'll all be good." And she convinces her to move back to Oklahoma City. So they get in their car and they drive, and it takes them days to get back to Oklahoma City. It's an actual trip and a journey for them. But when they get back, of course, the father hasn't changed. And very quickly, he would turn up drunk and angry. He would go back to his gambling ways, and the mother is stuck. The mother is unable to support the children. And she takes the two boys, Jack and the older brother, and she puts them in an orphanage. It was one of the hardest things that she could do, but she could not simply take care of them. And it was heartbreaking for Jack because nobody wanted him. Well, shortly afterwards, his older brother would escape, and his older brother would not be caught, but unfortunately would be killed in an accident. And his body would be brought back, and Jack never saw him again. Well, shortly afterwards, an uncle heard, and he was embarrassed because he was on the board of a Presbyterian church, what was going on. He was rich, and he contacts another family member to have Jack taken out of the orphanage. And Jack is taken out, but unfortunately, the man's wife dies, and so he's given to the daughter. Well, the daughter finally gets tired of Jack and sends him back. So by this point, Jack is 17 and he's got a severe rejection. He goes right back into the same things his dad was struggling with, drink, and just really goes gung-ho with it. He's drinking, smoking, and just living it up in the world. Finally ends up very ill, and the doctors tell him that the drinking's killing him. It's ulcerated his stomach, and it's not good for him. So Jack decides, you know what? I'm going to stop. I'm going to change my life. I'm going to turn around and start being good. And he figures if he goes back to his mother's, who is in California, she will help him. So he goes back to California, meets with his mother, and he assumes his mother will keep him out of trouble. Well, the sister that very first night invites him to go to the dances. And she finally persuades him, and of course he turns up and right away goes back to his old ways. And he's drinking, and he ends up very ill. And he ends up, his heart is racing, he collapses, they put him on a chair, and a doctor is called. And the mother, she turns, he doesn't drink. But of course, she finds out he did. So Jack is struggling. Well, during the middle of this, he said, God, give me one more chance. Don't let me die. I don't want to go to hell. Give me one more chance. So once again, Jack recovers and tries to make things right. He tries to overcome, just like his father was. Very sincere, but sincerely wrong. And he takes his mother and they move to Fort Worth, Texas. Here, Jack gets a job working as a manager in a singer's sewing factory. And very quickly, he goes back to his old ways. He would come in late in the night drunk. And he's tossing and turning, and God begins to convict him. Until finally one night, the Lord turns and says, this is your last chance. See, God hadn't forgotten the vows. God doesn't forget. Thank God. We forget, but God doesn't. And God turned up and gave him one last warning. This is your last opportunity. So Jack heard it. And Jack's disturbed by it, and he's okay. Well, Sunday comes, and he doesn't know where to go. He has been joined so many churches because he's been trying to overcome this problem, but never succeeded. And he never found anything real in these churches. So he doesn't know where to go. He's been baptized and doesn't know where to go. And so he heard about people just, opening the Bible, putting their finger in a verse and using that. So he takes the phone directory, he opens it, puts his finger on it, and it opens up to the Church of the Nazarene. So that's where he goes. And he turns up at night early. He turns up at 6, but service doesn't start till 8. But he's desperate. So he stays, and of course, when the service opens, Jack is immediately ready. He gives his life over to the Lord, and he is born again. He is utterly changed. He now becomes addicted to the Lord. And one of the things to understand Jack, he is driven by a zeal. We look at the story, for example, of Matthew the tax collector, and how once he was saved, he gets a revelation of the compassion of God. Many people that, come and their sin was great and they were forgiven of much. Their understanding of the mercy of God is so much greater. And Jack had such a zeal to win the lost. He is burdened, and the call is there to go and to preach and to reach people. He now, every night, he's going to church. He's reading his Bible. He's singing morning and night. He's just caught up with the Lord. It drives his family crazy, but he is lost for the Lord. Well, finally, after 6 months approximately, his mother turns, where are you going tonight? Of course, she knew he was going to church. I'm going to church. We're having a revival meeting. So she decides that they're all going. And they all turn up. And during the altar call, the mother is convicted. And she says to the father, are you going to go down? And he's like, no. But she goes down, and of course, she is wrecked by the Lord. And she wants, I want what he has. Because she recognized something had radically changed Jack, and she wanted it. Well, that night, they stop off at a grocery store, and they're in the store, and they just start praising God, and they start shouting and praising God until the butcher who's there sees and says, you guys at a revival meeting, you got saved? And they, yeah. And that's an immediate how they are. They're sold out to the Lord. Jack just loves the Lord. Well, shortly afterwards, his sister would invite him to this tent meeting. The town was packed there. All these people were coming to this tent revival of this Pentecostal person. So she invites him to come, and he goes along, and she hears they're all talking in tongues and stuff like that. He wants to know about it. He's curious, and he turns up to this meeting. And in this meeting, he's amazed. They're talking about, empty me, fill me, give me the fire, pour out the rain. And he's like, which do you want? And this lady answers, both. And I don't understand this. I don't get it. And finally, the pastor stops and points him on. So, do you know Jesus? He says, I absolutely do. Are you baptized? Yes. And the Holy Ghost, yes. Do you have tongues? No, and I don't want them. He says, well, it's okay if God wants to make an exception for you and not give you tongues. And he gives him some stuff to look at. And so Jack goes away to study the scripture, and he begins looking, and he sees that with the baptism there's tongues as he reads the book of Acts. And so it's disturbing him, and he goes in to meet this pastor at the Nazarene church, and he says, you know, watch them, they'll put a spell on you. So, you know, he's just not careful of it. So he turns back up at the service. He doesn't want to go, but his sister, you know, convinces him to go. So he goes. And he's now convinced it's of the devil. And you know, they invite him. And he goes up the front. And you know, they're talking empty, filled. And finally he says, you know what, I don't get this. And he runs out of the meeting. It just, you know what, there's something, he's challenged by it. And he goes home, and the Lord begins to talk with him and tell him, you really want that. And ultimately he admits, says, yeah, I'll die if I don't get it. Because there was something, he knew he wanted it so badly. So the next night he turns up, and of course he turns up early with this absolute desperation. And he's standing at 6, the service doesn't start to 8. And he's waiting and waiting. He's desperate for the baptism. By 12 o'clock, they still haven't done it. He's just desperate until finally he gets baptized. And he is radically changed by this event. And he stays for several hours. I mean, it's a late night for Jack. But he would never be the same again. And the fire in him now for preaching grows. Well, after that, he would go and he would join a Bible school, and he went to the Assemblies of God Southwestern Bible College from 1939 to 42. And it's during this time he would meet Juanita, his wife. She falls in love with him at first sight and knows that she will marry him. He's not like that. He is just sold out to the Lord, and he sees everything from a spiritual perspective. He wants to serve the Lord and just wants to go after the Lord. He is looking for opportunities, and during that time period, of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor would occur. And Jack feels compelled by the Lord to join the Army. And he first goes and tries out for the Marines, and he fails the test, the Merchant Navy, I believe it was. And so the Lord says, I told you the Army. So he goes and he joins the Army. And of course, when he joins the Army, initially he's afraid to show his, you know, that he was a Christian. And he would pray and he would hide himself under the blankets praying, and the Lord, you know, convicted him. Throughout his life, he's so easily convicted by the Lord. And he's convicted. So he begins to live his faith out loud. And he becomes very quickly known as the preacher, the Holy One, the deacon. They start to persecute him greatly. In fact, one night they go to stick him into a bucket full of ice that's still got ice in it. And ice on the surface. They want to hurt him bad. And a wrestler steps in and actually rescues him. And he's got a protection as long as that wrestler's around. And he would preach to them. He shared with them, and they literally hated him for it. Well, they would move. And after they moved, he's taken up. There's a doctor, or he's brought in, and he's sent to a doctor. And the doctor would lock him up in a psych ward, declaring him insane. Well, he protests strongly, and he stands up and he starts to ask him all these questions about the Lord. He gives his testimony. You don't understand where I was and what God has done for me. And, you know, he's declared as a religious fanatic, just a crazy person. Well, he's in there for several days. He's complaining, and he starts to cry, and the Lord showed him through convicting him in the Word. But Paul and Silas in jail, and he begins to just praise God. In the midst of this difficult time, he begins praising God. And the ward boy hears it. And the ward boy's father was Pentecostal, but he never received Jesus. And he hears this man, and he comes in broken and in tears and says, will you pray for me? And of course, he gets prayed, saved, and filled with the Holy Ghost. Well, the boy says, I will not forget this. And the next day, Jack is finally released. But it continues, of course, with this persecution. So Jack now wants, and he's burdened to preach. And he goes and finds a local church. He would go, when he was in the army, he would go for, one of the things that persecute him, he would walk several hours, I think it was like 6 miles he walked to hike, to go to church every day for 6 months. That's what he was like. So now that he's been released, he goes looking for a church. And he finds one. He wants to preach. And he told Juanita, he says, I'm burning with a fire to preach. And unless you've got that call, it's hard to explain how much you are driven and want to preach. There's just something inside of you. You have to preach. So he finds this church and he tells the pastor, how he's called to preach and he wants to preach. And the pastor says, that's great. And he explains, my janitor quit. I'm in need of a janitor. And Jack's like, you're not listening to me. I don't want to be a janitor. I want to preach. So he goes home, and of course, the Lord convicts Jack. So he goes back and says, I'll do whatever you want. And the pastor says, I'm glad to hear that. And of course, he begins working as a janitor. And then he's allowed to teach Sunday school. He thought, this is great, except it's toddlers. And he finally would make his way up. And so ultimately, he's able to preach. And then the pastor takes a leave for a while, and he's brought in to pastor the church for a while. But once they find a pastor, he's let go. So Jack now decides, he is going to start a church. And they begin working on this church. But he needs help to start it. So he calls back his wife, started this. He had actually encouraged his wife and these two ladies to form this band, a Christian band. They went around worshiping. And he invites them to come back and help him start this church. And they agree, they come back. But unfortunately, he is called back into the army. So he never does get the chance to start. Well, after he comes back, he ends up taking ill. And he comes down with malaria, I believe it was. And he is dying. And they look at him, they send him to a hospital, and they say, we have some experimental drugs, we'll try on you. But they're failing. And they ultimately come to him and said, look, we're sending you home because you're dying. There's nothing more we can do. And so Jack, by this time, he is married. His wife is expecting. And he comes home, and he's lost a lot of weight. He's not doing well. And he's seeking the Lord, and he would get better for a little bit and begin to preach a little bit. And then it would just decline. And he's struggling, like, God, what am I supposed to do? His liver and spleen swell up. He's in a bad shape. And he really he takes time of prayer and fasting and going after the Lord. And he's trying to understand the healing ministry. Now, previously, there was an account where his sister he had a vision of his sister taking sick. And he saw her going to this hospital, and he saw what happened to her, and he saw the Lord healing her. And it turns out shortly afterwards that the next day he's called, and his sister is ill. And it would begin him really seeking after the healing ministry. So he begins reading about it. But of course, he goes to the sister, and he's telling you, God will heal you. And he gets desperate in prayer. In fact, he's one day in a taxi car praying, and the taxi guy's like, you know what, you better be careful you don't have a nervous breakdown talking like that. He says, I'm not talking, I'm praying. There was an intensity. And he says, I'm a desperate man praying. Well, his sister did get healed. So here he is now sick. And he's going after the Lord, he's praying, and finally the Lord turns up. Because that time period, one of the things he began to do was go through his life and allow the Holy Ghost to expose things in his life that needed changed. And he wants to get everything under the blood of Jesus. He wants right with the Lord. As I said, there's just a man that's so easily convicted. So he feels this warmth come all over him, and the Lord said, you're healed. Well, it's 3 a.m, I believe, something like that. He jumps up, wakes up his wife, and says, I am healed. Honey, I'm healed. The next day, he gets up to go preach on the streets. And it was around that time period in the evening, he would start to see the symptoms. And the devil starts to tell him, you know, and try to fake up the symptoms. And he said, no, I'm healed. And from that point on, he never experienced the symptoms again. But the Lord, you know, he told the Lord, you know, what am I supposed to do? What am I going to do? And the Lord said, I called you to preach. Go preach. Go hold revival meetings. I don't know how. He said, I will open doors. So he begins. They're going to do this. Now, when they were a young couple, just got married, Jack was always a giving man. He had raised $1,000, saved it before he got married, and he just gives money away. He just feels led by the Lord. He sows seed. And so when they got married, they had this house that they had no furniture, no beds, no nothing. And God filled it. God was faithful because they're in the army at the time. They get this government housing. God fills it and gives them a car. So he feels led now to hit the road, and he buys a tent. And in fact, one of the things they would feel led to is to sell their home and just go buy a trailer and a truck, and they begin to hold these revival meetings. And one of the first things he does is he tells everybody, we're going to have a revival meeting, and the Lord is going to heal. The blind will see, the lame, the deaf will hear, the lame will walk. And he makes a bold statement. In fact, the lady that's there with him is like terrified. Like, you can't say that. What if God doesn't? They said, God will. And so they hold this first revival service. And of course, you know, slowly the crowds come. And there's a big line. He begins to line up to pray for people. And of course, there's people with headaches and various things, all easy stuff. And then finally somebody comes up that's blind. And he looks and he realizes God, suddenly a fear came on him. It's like, if she doesn't get healed, it's all over. My revival is all over, God. And God again rebuked him, convicted him, and he went and he prayed over her. And she says, I see men as trees walking, basically. And so he takes the oil, because God had told him, put oil, and puts oil on her and prays, and immediately she can see. Well, you can imagine the impact that when suddenly this blind lady can see. It opened doors. So all of a sudden, people start calling him to come to various places to preach, and he's invited to Oklahoma to preach. And again, you start to see phenomenal miracles. People that are blind see, the deaf hear. Powerful, powerful miracles in the ministry of Jack Coe. Well, in 1948, he would actually go to Redding, California. The Lord tells him to go to Redding, California. And he said, I don't want to go there. And the Lord tells him to go. And on the way, he stops because he's just out of money in Santa Ana, I believe it was. And he holds a meeting there. And there's a woman that comes in. And the woman would get dramatically healed. And as a consequence, you know, he, you know, tells people, you know, I'm standing for money. And a woman comes up to him and says, you know, how much you need? And she writes him a check. And it's just enough so they can now get to Redding. God, again, is working phenomenally. When he gets to Redding, of course, the devil is already stirring things up. He begins to set up his tent, and the fire marshal turns up and says, you can't set that up. It has to be fire protected. It has to be, you can't have a fire. And, well, how much is it going to cost? They spent $400 on this tent, everything he had. Well, it's going to cost $1,400 for somebody to come out and paint the tent. So he goes in and says, how much do we have in offering? Something that's worth $140. And he buys the stuff himself and he begins to paint. And the fire marshal comes up and he's got the thing set up. It's been painted with the fire retardant. And the marshal, I can't approve this. And so Jack begins to cry. He's broken. And the fire marshal sees that and says, if it means this much to you, you can have your meeting. And, you know, phenomenal things would happen. On the West Coast, there's a lady that comes up, and she is in braces and wearing crutches. She can't walk. and they've taken part of her bone out. I mean, she's in bad shape. And she comes and she gets told by William, or Jack, you know, he prays over and says, go home, take your braces off, the Lord's going to heal you. And she gets home and she actually falls asleep. And she wakes up and the Lord speaks to her and says, I told you you're healed. So she takes the braces off and she decides to get down on the ground and kneel and pray. And it's the first time she's ever done that. And then she gets up and the next day she goes into town. She goes to Montgomery Ward. She wants to buy some clothes. And the people in the town see her walking and they are amazed. Well, that caused quite a stir. She would go visit her husband who was in Oregon. He didn't even recognize her. Well, Jack Coe took her to the radio station because he wants to give her testimony of the radio. And the woman at the radio station knows the lady, sees her, and is so shocked. She asks, and she brings out her Bible, for the baptism. And Jack says, come to the meeting tonight. Well, that night she gets spirit-filled and God moves powerfully in the meetings. And Jack would see many people healed, saved, and spirit-filled in his meetings. Well, he would go, and one of the meetings he had was in Lubbock, Texas. I should say far, I'm going to go back here. In 1940, that was the first time he'd actually meet Gordon Lindsay. Of course, he was the editor of the Leaves of the Healing magazine of William Branham. And they would begin to work together, and he'd now be featured in that magazine. Now, in 1950, Jack Coe would actually start his own magazine, the Herald of Healing, that by 1951 had 35,000 people subscribing and 100% people would renew their subscription. By 1956 it had 250,000 and by 1957, the year he died, it had 300,000. So it became a very powerful opportunity for him to really reach people, and testimonies that came in through that magazine were incredible. The lives that were healed and changed through that magazine. William Branham would then go to Lubbock, Texas. And in Lubbock, Texas, the first night, this young freckle-faced boy comes up and says, please take me home, mister. He's got a lisp. And he's dragged away by a woman. And he realizes that the child is an orphan. So then he goes home and he's really broken. He tells his wife, and he says, you know, the Lord's put in my heart to start a children's home. And she said, you know, I've always felt led that I would work in a children's home. So if the Lord's told you, go for it. And so he then goes to the next night to the meeting looking for the boy and doesn't see the boy. But he now makes an announcement that he's going to begin building this children's home. So they get a lot of land in Dallas where they're going to put up the children's home. And people start, in his revival meetings, he would share about it. People start giving supplies, finances, and of course construction would begin on the children's home that would start, and of course they would be able to bring in children. They would sell their home and they'd actually move in. They'd got a new house by this point. They sold it and they actually moved in and began to live in the healing home, or in this children's home. William Branham also, he becomes burdened. One of the things he realizes that why are so many people not getting healed? And he, you know, Lord, what's going on? And the Lord would share with him that a lot of people simply are ignorant. At this time, people were going based on an anointing and laying hands on people and they're getting healed. But people, the preachers and the people didn't understand healing. So Jack would ultimately restart a healing home as well later on, as we'll discover. Now, I'm going to tell you a story about the children's home. There was a young boy that turned up. And Jack was known as a loving father. He was a jokester. The children that were there loved him. And this young boy wants to come along, but a doctor checks him out and he's got some contagious disease and it's not looking good. In fact, they've all got to get rid of their clothes for being in contact with him. And he goes to Jack and Jack says, I'm sorry, you can't. And Jack grabbed the boy, brings him in close to his chest, holds him tight and prays over him. Then asks for the doctor to check him again. The doctor comes back and said there's no sign of the disease. He can go into the orphanage. Jack was broken for children. He remembered what he went through, and it was really in his heart to help children as well. Well, he would go and he did many revivals. In fact, he would have one of his biggest revivals. He was ordained, and I forgot to say this, he was ordained in the Assemblies of God Church. But very quickly, he would have controversy with the Assemblies of God. In 1953, they would basically charge him. There would be a little strife between them. They felt that he was living extravagantly, and they disagreed with a lot of things, and he felt that they were not holding fast the fullness of the healing ministry and of signs and wonders. He went after them. And ultimately, they got tired of him, and they expelled him from the Assemblies of God. And so one of the things he decides to do, he's going to start an independent church. It will be a revival center where people could come, and there would be a revival all the time, where various people would come in and start revivals, and they would then spread this throughout the country. They'd have various revival centers where revivals would go on all the time. So he starts in 53, the Dallas Revival Center. By the end of the year, it's been so successful, it has now outgrown the building that they have to build a new one, which would open in January of 1954. Shortly afterwards, they would begin working on the college. I think he's starting to sense the shift that many were realizing that God was going to bring in a teaching anointing to start training people how they didn't have to just come to a person to get healed, but how they could walk by faith and receive healing themselves. And so he begins to work on this college as well that would be built right beside the children's home. Well, shortly after, he would go to Pittsburgh, and he holds one of his biggest revivals in Pittsburgh, an incredible revival there. He would go to Miami, and in Miami, he would be arrested for practicing medicine without without a license. And he's given bail for $5,000. Well, he encourages as many healing ministers to come down and support him. He said they have to make a stand. Miami was known at the time to be anti-ministry. And so he's taken to court, and in court, all these healing evangelists turn up, testify on his behalf, and the judge is ultimately forced to drop the case. Well, he would go to Kansas. And when he comes to Kansas, by this point, he's competing with Oral Roberts. He wants the biggest tent, and he's got this massive tent. He's lost, I think, 3 tents through storms, where he's seen the roofs ripped off them through storms. And he's been praying over it, seeking the Lord. And he comes to Kansas, he begins the meeting, and the Lord turns and says to him to take down the tent and move on. They've been having flooding, but he's been told, and people are saying, don't worry, the dikes won't break. Florida or Kansas is safe. But he said, no, take it down. He feels a sense of urgency. And in fact, some minister comes to him and says, just trust God to take care of the tent. It'll be all fine. He said, I do trust God, and God has told me, take it down. And you'll also see that in Jack Coe, when he heard from the Lord, he knew it was the Lord, he just did it. He refused to bow and bend to religious spirits and control of people. He was a man that just went after God. There was a pioneering spirit. There was a Reformation spirit. There was a lot regarding this man. And one of his key successes was that he was just driven. And he had an obedience to the Lord. And when he heard the Lord, he did it. So by 7:30, they're trying to take down this tent. It's still not down. And he steps in, feels compelled by the Lord to take over and said, we've got to get this tent down. Well, by 10:30, they finally got the tent down, and they began to pull out just as the sirens go off and the dikes have broken and Kansas is flooded. Now, during his campaign there, he had warned the people of judgment coming. He felt led by the Lord to warn, and many people mocked him and came against him, though he did see many people saved. Unfortunately, that would be one of the biggest floods in U.S. history, and many people were drowned and lives were taken. As they were leaving, Jack tried to save as many, help many people. as possible, help the minister get, furniture and himself out of the way, because Jack was like that. Well, Jack, as I said, would continue. One of the things, Jack, when he was doing revivals, he'd be gone for, many weeks at a time, preaching 3 times a day. One of the things that he was very negligent about was his body. He didn't take care of his own physical body. He would often work and have 1 hour sleep. He would come back, he'd be staying in someone's home, and people would come and seek him prayer, so he would be interrupted. And the Lord told him about this, but he just wanted to burn out for the Lord. He was sold out to the Lord. There was a zeal and a fire, and he just wanted to reach as many people as possible. He felt led that the Lord was telling him that he was going home soon, and he just felt disturbed. I've got to preach and reach as many as possible. A year before he died, he really felt compelled. The Lord told him that he was dying soon. And he took ill, and he thought it was exhaustion. In 1956. He thought it was just simply exhaustion, but it turned out it was more than exhaustion. He was dying with cholera, and he would end up being put in hospital, and he did it for his wife's sake, but when he's in hospital, he's unconscious most of the time. When he does come around, he gives her guidance, and he lets her know that the Lord has told him he's going home. And I think it was December 16th, 1956, he would be promoted to heaven. It said that his body had the body of a 90-year-old man. He really had run it into the ground. But he had accomplished many great things for the Lord. It's hard to not underscore his zeal and his passion for the lost. And I think if more of us had that and refused to be stopped and hindered by religious spirits that want to control us, but press forward and preach the gospel, we could turn this nation upside down. His wife continued to continue with his ministry after he died, and I believe she died in around 1996, I believe it was. The sons continued in ministry after him, and I believe that one son, Jack Jr., died in 2019. So he left a legacy afterwards of those that would continue. He raised up many people. And he was a blessing to the body. He was controversial. He was reckless in many ways. But at the same time, he had a great burden for the sick and a hatred of sickness, an absolute hatred of sickness. And he saw phenomenal miracles. He saw creative miracles. I started to see where missing limbs were replaced. Just phenomenal signs and wonders followed this man's ministry. Well, as I said, as we look at him, he could have allowed his past to hijack him, to take him captive and hinder him. The hurt, the rejection, the bitterness of the past could have destroyed this man, and even as he moved along, could have hindered him, come back in, caused him to be bitter, but he never allowed it. He went on and moved on from his past. When he finally repented, he never looked back. He never went back. And you have to give him great credit for that. And we need to make sure that we are not held captive to our past. Your past does not dictate your future. Jesus does. And if we will simply walk out in faith and obey, God can take you from the worst circumstances and situations and work a miracle in your life and cause you to be blessed to be a blessing. And Jack was. Jack changed that generation and continues to change every generation. He had a word in season for people that he paid a heavy price for. And he had to learn to overcome a lot of things in his life. He kept a heart soft to the Lord. He wasn't perfect. One man, a prophet, claimed that, before he died, he'd gone to Jack and the Lord had told him to judge himself regarding 3 things. 1, the love of the brethren. 2, the love of money. And 3, his body and his weight issue. The Coe family denied that ever happened. And, whether it did or not, we don't know. But the reality is, we look at Jack's life, he was convicted a lot of times. There are a lot of things that he clearly did wrong. He didn't care for his body like he should have. And, he was controversial. He was outspoken. But at the same time, as I said, there was a mercy, a compassion towards children, towards the sick, towards the lost, that very few people carry or lay hold of. And I pray more of us would get that. Well, I pray that you're blessed, and I pray that God would stir up the high call on the inside of you, and that you would give all to see this generation won for Jesus. That you would not allow your past to hold you captive or dictate your future, but you would look to Jesus and fix your eyes on Him. God is not looking for perfect vessels. None of them are. Jack Coe was clearly not a perfect vessel, but God was able to use him as he was simply being faithful, walking out in faith and obedience. And God can use you too. Amen. Well, thank you. Please check out more in the series. May they bless you, encourage you, inspire you in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.